Like how my life's going?
Your life's gone?
Yeah,
I'm sorry to hear that.
it's pretty sad.
Yeah. You're still here though, so that's cool. How's that dragon fruit vitamin
It's
water?
really bad. I'm still gonna drink it because I spent money on it, but it's not good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. How's everybody else doing? How's life?
Just took an exam.
Took an exam. Wonderful. So this must be a relief to be here. After the exam.
I suffered enough.
Sorry?
I suffered enough.
I'm sorry, what?
I suffered enough. Time
You
to.
suffered enough. Okay. But life is suffering. So can you talk more about that? Yes, Mercedes?
I got a new podcast that I really like because it's about history and it's good.
What is it about? What is it called?
Each episode is like different, but it basically is like sort of relating to like current controversies. And I was listening to an episode about the relationship between America and infrastructure and how there's two different types of infrastructure.
Okay, what is the podcast called?
Now and then.
Now and then. And you would recommend this to your fellow students, your classmates? All right. Anybody else? Anything else? Anything else in the world? Any comments, questions? Nah?
Well, there was a email sent out, I think, to all the students where Ann Applebaum is going to give a speech or like a Q&A with the dean of the college. So that's pretty dope.
She was supposed to come last year, right? But she was canceled. She was supposed to come last year. She had a nice article in the news. Was it the Atlantic?
I'll tell you later.
Anne Applebaum. Probably intellectual. Anne Applebaum. Anne. A-N-N-E. A-N-N-E. Applebaum. Public intellectual. I never heard of her until the whole Trump extravaganza brought out all sorts of people. But apparently she's famous. So famous enough for her to be invited to do a talk.
Wait, is that the girl who pooped her pants?
No.
No.
No. What? What?
Nothing. I was
Okay,
thinking of something else.
I have a bureaucratic announcement to make, which is that I don't have anything to grading yet. I'm still in the process of grading them. I apologize. It's taking me long. I just finished grading the papers for my other class, which were due about a week before yours were. So hopefully by the end of, by Monday, you will have your papers graded and I'll be able to release them. I'll say more about that later. But I do apologize for that. One of the things this weekend, fun things for me, was going to the emergency room with my daughter in the middle of the night because she had a high fever. So that was fun. But other than that,
how's she doing now?
she's fine. She's fine now. She's just like, in the middle of the night, all the doctor's offices are closed. The only place you can go to if she has a fever is the ER. So that's where we were. It's fun. So I apologize for that, and I'll get you your papers back shortly. All right. So here's what I want to do. I feel like I'm not getting sort of the energy that I need. I think I need a coffee at this time. But I felt that I was dissatisfied with my performance as a teacher on Wednesday. Only towards the last 4 minutes of the class was I able to get anything like the traction I wanted in terms of your interest, in terms of my own passion. But then we ran out of time. And it's a question that I asked that has been bothering Ariana the entire weekend, or Thursday, Friday, and then the weekend. And so we're going to start with that. We're going to try and address that question again. We're going to try and use that question as a wedge with which to enter into the world of Buddhist political theory. Now again, as with Chinese political thought, as with Confucian political thought, I want to be careful insofar as I don't want to reduce this, although it is amazing on its own terms, I don't want to reduce this to a class on meditation or a class on religious studies, which you can take classes in that department. They're wonderful people there. They will teach you amazing stuff about world religions. This is a class on comparative political theory. So I want to work our way towards the political theory part of it, but I don't want to rush you there. And my dissatisfaction with myself on Wednesday is that I felt I rushed you there. So rather than having a recap, as we normally do, I'm going to do a little bit of a restart. And we'll see how we do. So last time, for those of you who were in class or those of you who were online, I told you about something. I asked you a question. And I told you about these Buddhist monks I saw in India, that this is pre-COVID, so this is not because they were trying to prevent infections. They wore masks on their faces, and they carried a little broom with them. And they walked barefoot, and wherever they walked backwards. And they swept the floor in front of them. And I asked you the question, what do you think they were doing? Did anybody go and do some research on this? Everybody was intrigued, nobody was going to go and find out on their own. Excellent.
Oh, it was just an anecdote.
Sorry?
It was just like a personal anecdote. I just didn't realize.
Sure, I mean, it's actually a practice. It reflects a practice. But I understand. So I'm glad. I'm glad nobody ruined it for me. So I get it. So the context in which I'd asked you that question was, do you think life is suffering? And everyone was like, oh, it has ups and downs, and it's bad sometimes, it's good sometimes. Which if it were true, then the first principle, the very first noble truth of the Buddhist philosophy would have to be jettisoned. Because the Buddhist philosophy is life is suffering. But if we experience life as like a series of ups and downs, then why don't they say that? Why isn't that the noble truth? Life is a series of ups and downs. Why do they say life is suffering? Dukkha. Why do they say that? That's the word they use. I didn't cough. Word. Depending on how you spell it. Why do they start with that? The connection was, this is going to be our wedge to try and get into this world. The connection was that these Buddhist monks that I saw, what they were doing was they were recognizing that even in moments when they are not suffering, their enjoyment, their happiness is bought by the suffering of some other creature. What does that mean? That means that in this world, according to the Buddhist philosophy, or the Hindu philosophy from which it derives, we'll come to it in a bit, there are no remainders. Everything is part of a calculus that rounds itself out. Let me explain by stepping away from this picture for a moment. By telling you a little bit about, and this is how you would kind of see it, the story of Buddhism and the West, broadly defined. I'm not going to go into the now and then version of how Buddhism was received in the West and who were its early practitioners. I don't know enough. I don't care enough for our purposes right now. But there's a certain conception of Buddhism that you'll find, which in some ways is a little hokey, what I'm about to describe, but I think at the same time comports with a certain reality, underlying reality. I went to college in a town called Ithaca, New York. Anyone been to Ithaca, New York? Its tagline is Ithaca is gorgeous. Gorgeous. It's a play on word. It's very beautiful. And it's like all college towns, or like most college towns, it is a leftist haven for hippies, aging hippies, and associated folks. And there are about like 3 or 4 shops in the downtown area, all of them specializing in Eastern philosophy. So you walk in there, there's a little bell that tinkled, and you open the door, and then you smell of incense just assails you as you walk in. There's a shelf after shelf of crystals that are supposed to have different kinds of healing energies and pendants and books by the Dalai Lama, or who are you reading, Andrew?
Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes, I was relying on you to pronounce it actually. How do you spell her name?
THICHNHATHANH. There's like some accent marks too, but I don't remember.
Sure. So if you go to a bookstore and you go to Barnes and Nobles, for instance, with the Barnes and Nobles that exist, you'll go to the philosophy section, you'll find lots of this person's stuff about meditation and mindfulness and all this other stuff. And what you feel immediately upon entering this space is what's being sold to you is a lifestyle, right? Mindfulness books and like incense and various kinds. I mean, they all have the same. Actually, you know what? What am I saying? Of the sheer variety of incense that exists in the world, the one that you always smell in this place is this one, not jumping. You're like, why, dude? There's so many nicer incenses out there. Anyway, so you're being sold a certain lifestyle. And that lifestyle comports with or maps onto a series of political positions normally associated with the left. And when you think about it hard enough, you realize that behind this veneer of progressive politics with crystals and pendants and incense and chanting music in the background and little bells that you can tong to center your mind, there's a certain absence of depth. Depth because behind Buddhism is a whole series of beliefs that the person who enters the store in Ithaca, New York, or any of the associated stores of that sort that you'll find in the US, does not seem to even be aware of, or uses this word, which has tremendous importance for Buddhism, in the most lackadaisical way. Like, dude, that's bad karma. You familiar with the phrase bad karma? What does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything, actually. It's a terrible destruction of a very deep philosophical concept. So there's a way, my point is, there's a way in which we have understood Buddhism in the West and connected it to a kind of politics in the West, which is removed from the deeper philosophical, theoretical commitments of this religious belief. Now, the article that I gave you to read, did anybody read the one by Matthew Moore? One person. I hope more of you do. It's a very easy, right? Yeah. It's not hard. It's a very simple, basic idea that tracks the nature of the question of mindfulness, which we'll come to in a bit, in its relationship to Buddhism and politics in the US. Because what Matthew Moore does a good job of is to show us that if you divorce this idea, this lifestyle concept as it has been accepted in the West, if you divorce it from its philosophical roots in the context from within which Buddhism arises, you get a very vapid politics. The actual politics of Buddhism is much more complex and perhaps not palatable to us in the ways that we would like it to be. So I want to talk about that. Now that was my segue to come back to those monks. What are those monks doing? Those monks are saying that we refuse to spread harm in this world. Or even if we cannot help but harm, we will at least acknowledge its presence in our lives. Now, what does that mean? The reason they walk barefoot, the reason why they wear masks, is in some ways performative. But the thing that they're trying to prevent, they cannot actually prevent. But they walk barefoot so that they don't accidentally, by desensitizing their feet, unthinkingly step on and kill insects and ants and bugs that are crawling on the ground. They might still do it, but they walk barefoot so that at least if they feel something, they can move their feet away. They walk backwards with a little brush, sweeping their own footprints so as to leave no trace of their being. Clear the path for whoever walks next. They wear masks in order to prevent themselves from accidentally swallowing a bug or an ant or something, or a gnat, and thereby killing it. Because part of their belief is that all life is not just sacred. Like, all life is sacred, says the person who goes and eats chicken nuggets at McDonald's. When they say all life is sacred, what they mean is that all life is a soul working its way through a karmic cycle. And to destroy life is to interrupt the lessons that one acquires on that karmic cycle. Now, what is that? So the Buddhists believe, at least the version that we're interested in today, the Buddhists believe, like the Hindus, that we are, all of us, caught in a karmic cycle, which is that our present reality, whatever it is, whatever your present reality is the product of choices and actions made by our soul, by ourselves, in previous lives. We are constantly being incarnated again and again and again, living out a life that is a product of circumstances that we did not choose directly in our present life, but are nevertheless the product of choices we made in our previous life. Now, what is that? Why is that important? For one, as we saw with the essay, with the Bravik essay, for instance, what this means is that fundamentally, this is a deeply individualistic belief system. In other words, your existence is the consequence of choices that you have made in the past. Which means also that the person whose life you pity and you weep for, one who suffers, that person has also lived a life, is living a life that is the consequence of choices that person made in the previous life. That we are all individually important for, responsible for our own salvation, our release from the cycle of life and death, which is nirvana, not the name of a stupid god. Tell that to a Generation X person that nirvana is a stupid band, and they get angry. Tell it to your parents, they'll get very angry. Anyway, each of us is responsible individually for our release from the cycle of life and death. But what is that? What is the implication there? Well, before we get to that, let me tell you, I think I've asked this question before. Has anyone read Friedrich Nietzsche?
Wait, what was the, I didn't hear.
It was what?
Has anyone read Friedrich Nietzsche?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Friedrich Nietzsche has this book of aphorisms called The Gay Science. And in it, he has this aphorism, which is called The Greatest Truth. And it works as a thought experiment. And I want all of you here in this room, and those of you who are online, to engage in this thought experiment with me. And I'll try and repeat as much as I can of what Nietzsche himself says, because he says it very beautifully. I don't have it ready in front of me to read off the screen, so just work with me. He says, imagine if in your quietest quietude, your loneliest loneliness, when you are with yourself, truly with yourself, a demon comes to you and tells you that this life that you have lived, every moment in it, every sigh, every exclamation, every joy, every disappointment, even the spider web in the corner of your room, the moonlight breaking through the window, all of it, even the demon himself and you right now in this moment. You have lived this existence already innumerable times before and will also live it exactly in the same way innumerable times in the future. Everything repeating itself constantly, again and again and again, in the same order, in the same way. Would you gnash your teeth and pull your hair and screech with pain upon being told this? As you must inevitably. Or have you ever in your life experienced a moment that will help you say to the demon, you are no demon, you are a God. And what you've given me is the greatest gift. If this thought takes possession of you, nature says, you will be transformed by it. Why? Why would you be transformed by the idea that you have lived this life over and over and over again, and every moment in it until now, and every moment from now until the end of your life, you will live again and again and again and again and again, the same exact order? How many of you would be like, yeah, that's great, it's fantastic, wonderful? Two people? Three people? Really? Wow, we're in the presence of three great souled people. Why? Why? Tell me. Really?
I guess there's some kind of like resolve in the fact that like you've already lived through it, and kind of like, how do I put it? You know, I don't know how to explain it, but it's almost like what's the word? A comfort to know that it's already happened and it's going to happen again.
There's a
Does that
comfort
make sense
in
that there's sort of the fact that you have no control over things gives you control over the fact that you have no control?
Okay, so you've given up control, so you feel like, it's all fated anyway, I'm gonna live out this life exactly. Really? I mean, so basically, knowing that every moment you'll experience from now onwards until the end of your life has already happened, has no particular significance?
Well, I wouldn't say no particular significance. Even if things happen over and over again, you'll still have that significance.
Okay, all right, John?
I just sort of thought of it in the context of, there's like this online like never-ending book that's just a random collection of letters, but theoretically anything that has or ever will be written is contained within that as a random like compilation of words. But that doesn't stop us from trying to write things, even if it could theoretically be like housed in that. So I think it could view your life in the same way, where maybe everything is already determined to happen, and you might not have a technical like impact on it, but you could try to live it as if you did, even if it's already mapped out somewhere.
Wait, so it's the same point as what?
Not necessarily a comfort like that you can get through it, but more that it doesn't stop, like knowing that something that I could write down is already housed inside some library doesn't stop me from writing it.
Okay. Somehow then, Mercedes?
It's like you're at peace with the circumstances you've been dealt with, and you understand that going against those circumstances will only lead you to suffer more than to be at peace with those circumstances. Because you can't change them, you can only like flow with them.
Okay, so you basically accept your fate. Well, that's what I'm hearing, and you carry on with it. Mercedes?
I feel that I find more comfort in the repetition of it, because it means that your greatest joys and every moment of passion, and with that comes your pain, will be experienced again. And it's having the ability to know that you yourself are infinite. And it just means that for every person that you love, you'll see them again. And for every moment that you have had a self-realization, you will experience that again. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Okay, all right. Nick, and then Nick, right?
Yeah.
And Maria then?
It sounds a lot like the myth of Sisyphus, honestly. How he has to roll the ball up the hill over and over again throughout eternity.
Yeah.
And, like initially he's very like miserable with his existence, but over time he realizes that there's really nothing he can do, so he might as well just be happy with the situation and make the best of it.
Okay, so we must imagine Sisyphus happy, as Albert Camus famously said. So the myth of Sisyphus, you're pulling this rock, pushing this rock all the way up the hill, and then you're fated for it to come all the way back down and do it all over again. Why would Sisyphus do that? Albert Camus, the philosopher, says we must imagine Sisyphus happy, which is to say we must impute happiness to him even if he doesn't experience any happiness. But hold on, so Maria, go on.
I just think I'd be a little bit different, like when you were saying it.
You were
I was
what?
like, That would be different, I think, than what was expressed, because I'm.
Expressed by whom?
Everyone.
Okay. Yeah, these are all enlightened beings here, so please tell us.
I just think when you were saying it, immediately I was all like, oh, so what do I need to do now to stop this? You know, because I don't like that. Over and over and over again, that kind of like, that doesn't bring me comfort. You know, that would make me think like, okay, so now I think I would be upset, like, because now I've been broken kind of out of the trance. Like, why would you tell me that? Like, I don't want to know that. And then be like, how do I break this now? What's the next step of what I'm this greater purpose? Because now it doesn't feel like I can serve any kind of greater purpose, like, because you're doing it over and over and over again, so that it's
Right.
meaningless.
Right.
I'd be like, okay, what's the next step?
Right. So I think I'm going to send you all the thing to read, and I want you to read it because it's actually quite powerful. And Nietzsche is not. Maybe you guys are enlightened. I don't mean to mock you guys. I'm sorry, but my impulse is with Nietzsche. I'm going to favor Nietzsche on this one because I think he's a very acute psychologist. He's a very insightful psychologist. So his basic premise is this. This is the key to that riddle solved. If you kind of on the point here. The question is not to break out of it. The question is not to necessarily find comfort in it, except through one way. The only way in which that sequence or that entire thing becomes comfortable to you, the only way you do not gnash your teeth and yank your hair and screech at heaven and instead call this demon a god who has given you a great gift, is if you seize that invitation. It's an invitation to actually act into the world. Because the only way I can live this life over and over and over again is if I choose to live it on my terms. If I do not compromise, if I do not compromise myself in terms of trying to make other people happy. If I'm living life on my own terms, then yes, I'll live it 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times because it's a life that I chose. Now Nietzsche himself was a very careful reader of Buddhist texts. And this is sort of the wisdom that he's culling from it, in a way. And the Buddhist idea here is that you are responsible for your reality right now. It is the consequence of choices you've made in the past. But you still have your future life to choose, and the lives that come after it. And so therefore, becoming aware of your responsibility to take responsibility for yourself is one of the first steps towards enlightenment. And the way in which you become enlightened is not going to be necessarily by improving other people's lives, by becoming, by doing good deeds that will get you into heaven or something like that. That's not necessarily the path. The path is of a different sort. It involves a certain kind of mindfulness, amongst other things. Simplicity in living, etc., etc. Now, Moore's point is that people in the United States, people on the left especially, have taken the idea of mindfulness and they've divorced it from all of the other stuff that comes before it. Now, why is life suffering? Let's go back to it. Life is suffering because if when you are not suffering, that relief is bought through somebody else's suffering or some other being's suffering. There is no neutrality in the world. So, for example, like right now, I'm knock on wood, just superstition. Knock on wood. I'm comfortable right now. I'm comfortable. Life is okay. It's not great, not terrible. Sure, I would like it to be great, but I'm very mindful of the fact that it could be a lot worse. So I'm happy where I am right now. Cool. But why am I happy? Am I not suffering anymore? Well, maybe. On one interpretation, sure. Life goes through us ups and downs. We all experience it, and we're carried along with it. And we'll come to that in a bit, in a moment. But on another level, I'm comfortable because I'm wearing comfortable shoes today. They're nice. There's some bounce in them. I feel my feet aren't hurting. My belt is not on too tight. My clothes are comfortable. I'm wearing, I cleaned my glasses this morning, so I'm not seeing smudged things in the wall. My point is, there are a number of external things that have made my sensation of the world pleasurable enough for me to exist in this world at a baseline level of comfort. But if I were to start asking the question of where did my shoes come from? Who made my shoes? What was the environmental cost of building these shoes? Were the people who made these shoes, were they paid enough? My clothes, my food, this wonderfully air-conditioned room that we're in, where those things come from, I will find that my indebtedness to the world is much greater than what I can repay on my own. And so while I'm not suffering right now in the way that the Buddhists think that people suffer, or life is all suffering, I am nevertheless able to acquire that relief from suffering by pushing that cost onto some others, onto some other people, somewhere else. Maybe future generations, maybe people in Bangladesh who made my shoes. Something has happened to make this comfortable for me, and likewise for you. So there's never any not suffering. It's just distributed in different ways. But then, and this is the part where I think the Buddhists are very close to the Stoics. If you were the Stoics, I recognize the connection. For the Buddhists, ultimately, all life is suffering. Because, and I think people said this last time, I think you said this last time, a few people otherwise as well have said it, is that ultimately your aspirations will come to naught. Because you will die. It could be a quick death, it could be a long, prolonged suffering leading into death. But death is coming for all of us. Spoiler alert. Apologize. I don't want to break this to young hearts. But it's coming for us. All. Different times, we don't know when. And at that point, there will be things that we have left undone, things that we will yearn for, things we will ache for, that we won't be able to complete. And in that moment, you'll have to ask yourself the question, as you must at every moment, including if you were Sisyphus, what is this all for? Why am I suffering? What is it that I'm doing with my life? Where is it ending? It's ending, the Buddhists say, in suffering. But it's ending in suffering because we are fundamentally attached to outcomes. We want things to work out a certain way. And when they don't, in some fashion, as they inevitably will not, for all of us, we might have wins along the way, but nobody wins at life. Everybody loses in some fashion, or manages to have somebody else pay the cost of it. Our attachment is what leads us down the path towards suffering. And so the thing that we must believe, first of all, is that the particular ways in which we are attached, the ways in which we suffer, are themselves the product of previous choices we've made. But if we recognize that fact, and we think to ourselves that our future choices can perhaps liberate us from this path, then we can perhaps learn to attach ourselves to different things. If attachment is inevitable, maybe we can change the nature of our attachments. And so the next step is to believe that escape from the cycle of life and death is possible. Escape from this constant karmic cycle is possible. We can get off that treadmill. Now, getting off the treadmill, again, is not a political business. We can't help other people get off that treadmill. There is no proselytizing here and converting people to your faith. That's going to save them. Everyone is living out the consequences of their own choices from past lives, and making new ones for their future lives. And once you recognize that there's a path out of this, then the next step is to seek the Eightfold Path. We're not interested in that today, except at the question of mindfulness. And so the question now becomes, and this is the article, what the article is kind of about, is what role does mindfulness play in politics? Does it have any role? So, before we get to the answer of what Matthew Moore have to say about this, and self and no self. Talk to me. Does anyone find this persuasive so far, this story? Is anyone's like, yeah, Maria, you find it persuasive?
I don't know what this is, but based on what you're saying, I have a question.
Sure.
You said that nobody can help you reach that self-enlightenment. So you said it's not something that can be like facilitated in an independent journey. But don't they teach like mindfulness practices, like can you implement?
Sure, okay, right, I see. Excellent question. So, so there's a distinction here. So, if suffering is your ailment, and one of the ways in which you suffer, let's say, is through want for food or shelter, then someone providing you food and shelter and ending your suffering in that way is not solving the question of what happens to your soul. It's still forced to live out the consequences of its previous choices. They just now reconfigured in a different way. Suffering will take a different form. Nobody can say, like, so, you know, like, you can imagine a left politics that says, think of a good way of explaining this. Help me reach a larger point. This is a great question, Maya. Thank you. So, before, I'm from India. So if you go to India, you see a lot of poor people. As the novelist V.S. Naipaul once said, you think you've seen the poorest person in the world? You go to India, you find someone poorer. Now, this poverty on such a vast scale, and it's degrading poverty, like really degrading poverty. You think, I mean, unless you're a completely unfeeling person, some part of you will say, what is to be done? How do I improve the lot of these 1.3 billion people? Not all of them are that poor, but quite a few are. And you think, okay, we need social policies, we need, urban policies, we need all kinds of policies to make sure people aren't starving, that people have education, yada, yada, yada. A Buddhist might say, sure, you can do that, but you've not really addressed the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is not about whether people have enough to eat or people have enough, food and clothing and shelter. The fundamental problem is how do they break free of the cycle of life and death? And that, no amount of food or no amount of shelter or clothing or whatever will do solve. So in that sense, the personal business of your salvation, no government policy can change.
But can I
Sure, please. Yes.
But like, I'm asking, not them like fixing social issues like the root of the problem, but more so like I wrote a paper one time about implementing mindfulness meditation for medical students or
Sure.
for like stress and things like that. More so like the way of thinking that they're proposing, like of mindfulness, in let's say like meditation, like your meditative practices, like
Sure.
that kind of thing. Like we're not solving an issue, but we're kind of teaching you how to think that could lead you to.
Right, so now the question, actually is an excellent point. So isn't the fact that the Buddha came into the world and gave us the Eightfold Path, isn't that already changing someone's, sure, I mean, to some extent, yes. But also, the ability to actually practice it and implement it is the personal business of an individual. You can't make someone more mindful if they're going to be mindful or not. But the question that Matthew Moore is also asking, which I want to come to in a moment, but I still want to ask the general question that I asked a moment ago. But the question that Matthew Moore is asking is that even if we became more mindful, what would it actually change? Would it change anything at all? So is anyone persuaded by the Buddhist story so far? Or are you like, I like my healing crystals and my gong and my Nag Champa, incense, that's enough for me. Nick, you're persuaded by it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty good.
Why? What's persuasive about it? I love this. Please, why?
I don't know, I just find it very, magnetist. I really identify with it. I think it's way more interesting than any, Western religion, to me
Cool.
personally.
Cool. Andrew?
I mean, I think the article you're talking about is really persuasive.
Okay, sure. I'm not persuasive at all. I know that.
Whoa. But I think it also mentions in the article Buddhists historically are pretty supportive of monarchism, for example.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's the other interesting thing. The two Buddhist regimes in the world are both
Thailand?
practice genocide. The Sri Lankans and
Thailand, I think.
the Burmese. Myanmar.
Myanmar, sorry.
So, when actually, when this all, so I knew a Buddhist professor at UF. This dude was like he used to love The Big Lebowski. And he was like, everything is like the view divides, man. And then for him, that was being Buddhist. But he pointed out to me that, actual Buddhist regimes are terrible places to live if you're not a Buddhist. So,
I think in the West, there's like an Orientalist perspective on Buddhism. And it's kind of ironic because Buddhism emphasizes like that you shouldn't focus on material. And the Buddhism that's sold in the West emphasizes material. So like, oh, you'll feel better if you buy these crystals, or you'll feel better if you practice these mindfulness strategies sold to you by authors like Deepak Chopra and stuff like that.
yes. I'd like to know how many people Deepak Chopra has cured. Remind me that Michael Jackson was one of his clients. Mercedes.
It's not that I necessarily don't find it convincing as an in-depth philosophy. It's just that I find it hard to find it personally convincing because it really conflicts, or it's just that when my fundamental beliefs emphasize the self and my attachments and that life is not repeated and that what exists is only how it exists now, it's very hard to find it convincing for my own personal self when what I understand is so fundamentally different from the very basic presumptions that Buddhism is based on.
Right. So I'm so impressed with Nick. He's given up his attachment to the entire Western way of being, and he said, "Take me, Buddha." But you're saying no. We are so deeply ensconced in a certain way of thinking that emphasizes the self, emphasizes the uniqueness of ourselves. That to think of it in this way, so that I mean, if I said to you, you are poor today because of the life choices you made in your previous life, how many of you would be like, yeah, that figures?
Not me.
Spencer, would you?
Yeah, like.
Go ahead, tell me why.
So there's like two ways I can think about it.
Sure.
It's like, there's the example you gave where like every life, you live the exact same life over and over again, and that's just like a pure nightmare to me, right? Like, that means not only am I incapable of changing, but so is everybody around me, right?
Yeah.
Like, that means like my father did the exact same thing, and then that means I did the exact same thing. And like, that means I went on to do something that caused somebody to do the exact same thing. So it's not just I'm trapped in this cycle and I can't break free. It's literally from like the moment you're born into this world, everything, like, if someone took a left, they always took the left, right? There's no going down the right, there's no blue pill, there's no matrix. But like when you say, like that time, you kill a butterfly, right? Like, yeah, in your next life, you're gonna like be an insect, and you're gonna be like, have to live a life of an insect. And like, that's fair, like I killed a butterfly, and I deserve it. Like, I feel like I could live with the consequences if it was just like my everlasting soul, like living different lives, but not like, I couldn't do this over and over again.
Except if you, okay, so Kirtan had asked a question that I didn't get to answer. Kirtan asked a question. She said, we wouldn't remember that we've lived it this many times, right? And yes, you wouldn't remember it. You wouldn't remember that the demon came to you and said to you in your previous life this exact thing. Or,
Oh, so the demon comes every time?
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so it comes every time and tells you. So the only way it becomes, according to Nietzsche, it becomes acceptable to us is if moving forward, we actually choose our life. And this is maybe when Nietzsche kind of departs a little bit from the Buddhists, a little bit, but not too much. Because the Buddhists also believe it is possible to become mindful of your life, become mindful of your choices. But understand that you are not going to be able to break free from the karmic burden that you carry with you. It's going to be with you. You can just learn to relate yourself to it differently. And that's what mindfulness, one of the things about mindfulness is, to become aware of your own feelings with respect to who you are and why you're here and what you're doing with your time. Politically, Matthew Moore says, look, mindfulness has limited applicability. He says there's some things that relate to our non-political selves and things that relate to our political selves. And mindfulness can help us become better people. Right? Next time I don't know. Spencer's example. When I did something wrong, I got scolded when I was a kid. I'm carrying this way of dealing with child rearing in my head. So when my daughter does something wrong, my impulse is to say, don't do that. Instead, if I become mindful of myself, I can say, oh, okay, that's my impulse. Become aware of it. Even if I become aware of it after I've already shouted at her, maybe over time I can change myself just a little bit to not replicate the same actions over and over again. There, mindfulness might be a wonderful thing. But what would it mean to become mindful, let's say, about the about questions that relate to your political self, especially questions of deep-seated belief? Let's say you are a pro-life activist. What would it mean to become more mindful when talking to an abortion rights activist, or vice versa? John and Mercedes?
I think that, if you're pro-life and you maybe hold a belief that it's murder or something, then you could try to rationalize where the other person's coming from, where maybe in their eyes being pro-choice is that if you force women who want to get abortions or maybe don't have the capabilities of taking care of a child to have that child, then you are then hurting her and whatever aspirations she may have for her life, because there's no systems that exist to maybe take that child if she has the child, or it would bankrupt.
But if I believe that abortion is murder, like if I fundamentally believe that, then what does it mean to become more mindful? How do I check myself and change my belief? Mercedes?
I think that it's important to become aware of the systems that both of you exist in independently, that you exist in different systems of life, that you've been built through different circumstances, and that you may subscribe to different systems of belief, but then to also become aware of the systems in which you exist together, and how the fact that you come from different places and that perhaps your life and your fundamental meanings are different from each other, but become aware of the conflicts that will arise from that when you exist in the same system together.
Yeah, but I still think that abortion rights activist is a murderer. And I'm like, I'm sorry that your karmic cycle has made you into a murderer, but you're a murderer nonetheless, and for which you must be punished. Right? So, I see your point, but I think there's certain intractability to deeply held political beliefs that may not be amenable to mindfulness. And Andrew, Mario, Spencer.
I think being mindful in this circumstance is basically pointless, because if you follow mindfulness to its conclusion, and if, let's say, you're a life activist or an abortion rights activist, these, like you said, intractable political beliefs, they're going to conflict at some point, because you can't be you can be aware of the systems you interact with, but if I'm a pro-life activist, if I take those beliefs to its logical conclusion, the only belief left is, oh, millions of people are being murdered.
Right.
But I'm mindful of it. That doesn't mean anything in a political environment, I guess.
Maria, then Spencer?
I think in the instance of politics, if used right, because it also depends on how much someone really understands what they need to do it, be mindful and apply it in any situation, not just when you are meditating or something like that. I would say that it would help someone gain a little bit more perspective in seeing maybe, I think especially with politics, one issue is not just one issue. One issue is originates from multiple different issues, and a lot of you would understand more of origins and implications, and you'd critically think more, because for example, if that's it, what I'm talking about that.
Yeah, it's about the theory course.
Don't get too you would kind of understand the argument. There's implications of okay, if you're talking about murder, specifically children, and you have to look at different systems where that are going to be involved. You would think of the welfare system, foster care, things like that, and look at, are those systems to be equipped with this kind of way of thinking, or are you just, further building a whole of already damaged.
So this is kind of the argument that Mercedes was making. It is kind of maps you become aware of your larger embeddedness within Interdependent structures. What's your name, sir?
Steven.
Stephen.
It feels like mindfulness can take like two separate directions on like definition in this.
Sure,
situation.
please, yes.
So one would be, I mean, in this particular like example, pro-life versus pro-choice, I feel like it would be like, oh, mindful of their like others' perspectives and stuff. So it's like kind of running to the middle of like the issue, even if there is the middle of it, to try to agree with somebody or at least understand like how their path has led them somewhere. But even then, I feel like that conflicts with your own personal beliefs, like you think it's murder. Then how can you do the right thing, but also like understand where they're coming from? I feel like that's like in and of itself like conflicting. So I feel like the other definition would be to think through your own perspective to, as you said, with logical conclusion, which would be like from, okay, it's not allowed, where does that go? What are the right decisions to make? As if there are like objective right decisions, which I feel like mindfulness in and of itself assumes that there are objective correct decisions at each step of like a particular, topic, if that makes sense. Like, okay,
Yeah, okay.
abortion's wrong, it's not allowed, okay, so as you were saying, like welfare state, foster care, like how do we take care of it from there? What's the mindful decision in each one of these situations?
Nick?
Could we like define mindfulness a little more, because I'm just kind of confused, everyone seems to be.
Yeah,
giving different definitions.
I'm also pretty confused, yeah.
Sure, I mean, so, like, maybe it's one of those terms that, you mean different things to different people. We can define it somewhat by looking at it when it's working well, right? So when mindfulness is working well in the Buddhist sense of the thing, is that we're a product of a series of causes and effects. Becoming even aware of the fact that there's a chain of causes and effects, and that what we think is an action is the product of previous actions, institutional context, as Mercedes and Maria are talking about. But also, like I'm shouting at my child because my dad shouted at me. That awareness of our own impulses, becoming aware of ourselves, giving a name to our feelings. That's another thing we're doing with a toddler right now. We're teaching her to name her feelings. Toddlers apparently have big feelings. They don't know how to make sense of. So we try and help her. You're feeling angry right now, or this must be very frustrating for you. Doing that to ourselves all the time with respect to monitoring our own emotional state. In order to understand, in order to create a map of our feelings, understanding our trigger points, understanding how in our own heads things connect with each other, becoming transparent to ourselves. That would be a form of mindfulness. Stephen?
Like, I believe that like the logical question from that is like, what do you do with that information?
Okay, Spencer and Mercedes?
Okay, so like, building off both points here,
Which points here?
The Stevens and Maria's point, of like how, not just understanding like someone else's position on that, like I understand that, but like in a true like core belief, right? If you believe abortion was murder, right, you would have a very clear and like decisive vision of what a human life was, and to become more mindful of your position in that context.
Right.
That would then like redefine how you feel about life after birth, after like pregnancy, after things like that. So like you might end up like analyzing that core position, right? If it's something that really can't shake you, it might change other positions that you thought were core to yourself, like in the prison system, or like how you feel about the death penalty or things like that. That would definitely like either point out contradictions in your life that you'd have to become aware of and then like resolve. And I feel like that's one way to make yourself more mindful and like center yourself.
Okay, all right, that's okay. So all right. So you so Christopher says in the notes here, mindfulness seems to be cognitive empathy with ourselves, to understand ourselves and understand how our feel. So it's okay. So this is the part of the essay that I liked very much. And I think this part is true. Maybe Matthew Moore goes too far in one direction, so I'm going to pull away from it a little bit. One of the things he says that I really liked was that when people who claim to practice mindfulness, they report a sense of how their sense of self is not as rigid as they'd imagined it to be. That in fact it is more porous. It's a word that Matthew Moore uses, porous, than what they had thought. So what does that mean? I think at some level it's worth digging here. Mercedes.
Well, I think that the question that you're asking is somewhere on the lines that earlier in the lecture that I had was because Buddhism like how does the system, how do you have a society that's built on Buddhism that emphasizes an individualistic philosophy? And I feel like a good way to answer that is at least how Buddhism approaches mindfulness. It means that it emphasizes your individual approach to it. And I think that an important distinction we have to make is that, at least in Western politics, we also individualize the self. But the difference is that that in Buddhism, when we have our mindfulness, it's to become aware of ourselves and turn inward so that we can then understand the relationships between ourselves and the world around us, which means that when you look inwards, that you find that your own definition of yourself is what you said, it becomes less defined, it becomes blurred. But then for Western practices of emphasizing the self, you find that when you have your own individualistic will and you define yourself, you then in turn try to enforce your will on others, which is to say that at least individually through Buddhism, it's to de-emphasize your individualism and to see that it's your own personal relationship and that it doesn't really necessarily apply to other people. So
Okay,
I
so
feel
let's try. Yeah, I see one. So let me, Mercedes, I see it. Let me see if I can illustrate it in some fashion. Yeah? I'm sorry to interrupt you. It just occurred to me that I can, it's an excellent point. So you're saying that in the Western world, essentially, we are living in a Hobbesian conception of life, where you are an individual atom that is going to conflict with another individual atom that is going to conflict with other individual atoms and so on forth, until you basically create a model of constant conflict. Is to manage that conflict, is to manage people's egos being driven wildly sort of out of proportion, and to inculcate a philosophy of fear, and thereby bring everybody down to the same level and make them accept the authority of the state. It's kind of, I think what I heard you say was something along those lines. Am I? Okay. Are you sure? I'm sorry for interrupting you. I was like, let me bring it back to Hobbes so that we can connect it. Now, mindfulness, you were saying, does something different. It helps us understand interconnectedness, but on a different model, and not on the model necessarily of conflict. Right? Did I understand you correctly on that point?
yes.
Okay, right. So that's great. Thank you, Mercedes. They did a science experiment, which I find, I get to throw science in the classroom, so it feels authoritative. So I don't know how they did it, but they did it in the following way. They attached electrodes to somebody's head to measure brain synaptic activity. And they put like electrodes or whatever on someone's skin. And they introduced a stimuli on the person's skin, close to it. And they measured which acted first, the skin or the brain. Now, if you were to follow the Hobbesian worldview of what human beings are like, there would be an authoritative center, that's your brain, that would feel the sensation. The sensation would be felt here. It would travel up to your synaptic nerves, into your brain. Your brain would process in milliseconds what's happening. It would create a command that would pass back down through those nerves, the strings, the wheels, into your arm, and your arm would flinch at the stimuli. What they discovered, however, was that the skin reacted milliseconds faster than the brain did, suggesting therefore that the self that was commanding the arm was not located in the brain, but was dispersed throughout your body. Now, the reason I say that is because when people practice mindfulness, according to Matthew Moore, they come to identify themselves as being more porous. I find that idea to be fascinating. But what I discover when I am mindful is that the things that are shaping my sense of myself are not the product necessarily of my own sense of myself, but that sense of self is itself the product of other things within myself acting. I don't know how you guys felt this way. Whenever I find myself thinking about the idea of vomiting, I feel like vomiting. And then I wonder to myself, what came first? Did I think of the idea of vomiting and then I felt like vomiting? Or was the fact that my body already felt like vomiting that it sent this idea up into my head as an intellectual idea and said, hey, what do you think about vomiting? Now I feel like vomiting. What acted first? Who was the actor? Where did the action come from? The Buddhist idea is that mindfulness will teach you that what you think of as the self is actually the product of other selves, or no self, really, that is acting within you. While I was waiting for class, for instance, to class to start, I was on Twitter and I saw that babies born today have more microplastics in them than adults do. They're like tiny bits of plastic that are inside your body. That was the way it was done. Microplastics. I mean, how would you like? Plastics don't disintegrate, but they break down, and they mix in with water, they mix in with food, the microscopic quantities, but ingested at high enough, rates, they can actually be detected in a child's urine and feces or whatever. And so fish, for example, have high levels of microplastics. So the question then becomes, if you're eating those fish that have high levels of microplastics in them, if you or your child has high level of microplastics, at what point does your child begin and what point does the microplastics end? Anyone ever had food that made you sick? Were you happy that day when you were sick? Were you feeling cool and cool, collected, calm self? Chances are you were not. You were the product of what you ate. So the Buddhist idea is that when you become mindful, or at least one version of it, is that you become aware of the fact that what you think of as a stable, continuous self, I think what Maria and Mercedes will be talking about, that self was in fact the product of a configuration of events that have allowed it to occur. And once you change the surrounding events, that self will also mutate to become something else. Change your diet sufficiently enough, and you will become a different sort of person.
So is this kind of like nature versus nurture, and they're kind of taking the side of nature?
This is, it's somehow, it's like Hobbes, insofar as it's a deeply materialistic nature is the way in which you're created.
Or I meant like from a psychological perspective, like nature versus nurture. Like they're kind of taking the side of nurture, like environment versus.
Would nature also be environment?
No, because like nature is like you're born, the personality that you are, and nurture means like your personality.
Sorry, I'm a little slower than I should be. Sure, yes, it would be the other side of nature. We're being aware of that. But politically, what that would mean, or at least according to Matthew Moore, is that you have the possibility, even if you believe strongly about something, of becoming more receptive to an understanding of how those ideas came into being for you. Under what configurations you ended up believing the things that you do, even if you then hold on to them. But the Buddhist idea fundamentally, I think, is that you wouldn't hold on to something that strictly for that long once you've actually put it through that level of analysis, self-analysis. Mercedes?
I think that the de-emphasization of self is really interesting, because even when you're in practices that are divorced from Buddhism, you see, especially when you have the science of studying the body, you see that there's a realization that the way we define the human and how we organize ourselves and how we categorize ourselves becomes unclear the smaller we make our scales of ourselves, because you come to understand that there is a huge microbiome of bacteria inside of you that is necessary for you to live. So then you're faced with the question is that if you need these things to survive, if they're a part of you and they necessitate life, do you define a person by human cells? Do you include bacteria cells? And it's something where it makes the shade of what is a human and what is just yourself hazier, because it's you're not divorced from the realities of things that are not necessarily purely you.
That's exactly right, Mercedes. And like, it just blew my mind when I realized that there are more microbes in my gut than there are, and deeper connections between them and between like the neurons in my head. My brain is where do I start? Where do I end? Prior to that, I had a very antiseptic conception of self, that I'm like a sealed vacuum with myself floating inside here and the world outside me. But the reality is that we're far more porous. And so there's a certain kind of destabilization of the human at the heart of this Buddhist world, which then also means that it decenters your understanding of responsibility in interesting ways. But maybe the different kinds of Buddhism there. Maria.
No, I'm sorry. Last thing you just said, no, that's in my head. And I forgot what I was going to say. Because I think you didn't know responsibilities when I was thinking.
Sure.
No, I won't talk about that. Because I was going to talk about, he discusses this American Buddhist, John Kabat-Zinn.
Okay, yeah.
I think that a lot of what the author is writing in the essay is also the same idea, like same principles of what this guy, and he's like the pioneer. When I wrote that paper, it's all this whole topic of like the Western mindfulness, that's him. Like
right.
He brought it, which I don't think that that's right. Like he just kind of stripped of the origins and just made it this like he's in his literal book is called like How We're Gonna Cure the World Through Mindfulness. But his interpretation, which is not based off of like Buddhism, it's just based off of like, you alleviate stress, you're less righteous, less emotional, less reactive and impulsive. And he wrote a whole book, I think it's called like literally mindfulness. And that translates into yoga and meditation and all these different things. But I think that even the meditation like would work better if you were understanding kind of like the Buddhist aspect of it. I think he calls himself a Buddhist. I think he kind of just stripped that part a little bit of the origin.
Right.
And really marketed also mindfulness. Anyway, I didn't mean to like.
But it's funny you mentioned that, because so I don't know if you know this, but until recently, yoga was banned in the state of Alabama in public schools.
Why?
You know this?
And that's a religious practice.
Yeah, because they treated yoga as a religious practice. And I think they were right. They're actually right, for once. I don't think the people who were doing this were necessarily that aware of it. But it's kind of like they basically they recognized that there is not just like yoga, like, like I'm sort of doing the stretch on the beach, but actually it's connected to something much more intricate.
There's also like proposals. I don't know who's proposing it. I think a lot of psychologists who come from the same kind of like stress reduction, mindfulness, proposing it to be implemented in schools, like in K through 12 schools, like students would be meditating. I don't think like students would be able to understand what meditation requires. I don't know if your mind's developed at that point enough to be able to meditate, but they propose it in schools, in like medical schools,
Sure.
schools, anywhere where there's stress.
I have a question then for you. And Andrew, Mercedes, I want to ask this question, and I would like everybody's input on this. What happens then to fear if you become more mindful?
I think you know what you become afraid of, instead of just fearing the unknown.
Okay, so you become less fearful?
Yeah.
Nick and John?
I feel like it would be helpful in like finding out where your real like true fears actually come from.
Okay.
If you like internalize that and you really think about like maybe like something that happened in your childhood or something
Sure.
that happened like earlier in life.
Right.
Because usually that's the trigger of what happens like later in life, like if you get terrified of some random instance, it's usually something that happened to you before you can like, internalize. Like, what
Right.
happened.
John?
I was sort of on that same point where you sort of understand why you fear things. Like, I used to be scared of like spiders and bugs and all those other sorts of things, but then once I guess I learned more about them and became a little more aware, and I wasn't as afraid because, you know, there's certain, once you learn like what spiders are poisonous and which ones aren't, you can understand like which ones are okay to have around and how they're actually, most of the time when they're in your house, they're a benefit because they get rid of stuff like mosquitoes and they don't really care about you.
Yeah.
And sort of that like awareness of whether I was just afraid of the unknown of it, and then once you learn, you're not as afraid.
Right. Andrew?
What about innate fears? Like, most people are afraid of heights, and that's a purely like rational fear, right? Like, are you afraid you're gonna fall and die? Or like, or even like irrational fears. Like, my grandmother and somehow myself are both afraid of like small frogs and lizards. Like, be around an alligator, be around an iguana. I dissected a giant toad, didn't care, but like little tiny ones, freaking out.
You live in Florida.
Yeah.
Congratulations. No, okay, so, okay, let's go with the answer to that question. I'm sure there's stuff out there amongst the Buddhists who have thought this through in more intricate ways, but to the degree that on one of the classical interpretation of Hobbes, fear is the overriding impulse that leads us to act in the way that we do, that creates this degenerative condition where we end up having to accept the sovereign, the Leviathan that will impose its authority on us, or even on the different version of Hobbes that I talked about on Wednesday, where our overweening, overwhelming sense of vanity injured leads us to seek redress and leads to all kinds of conflict, and the Leviathan comes in and teaches us, no, the only way to operate in this world is through fear, and that's the only thing you must be scared about. That, to the degree that fear is the basis for political authority, becomes destabilized. If by mindfulness we become less fearful politically of our opponents, fearful of what will happen to us if the world that we want, the kind of world we're attached to doesn't actually pan out for us, then the kinds of things you're willing to countenance also changes. Right? If I think I'm going to go to hell by not contesting the murder of innocent children who are being aborted, let's say if I had that worldview, and I think it's a worldview that people have, then I would be far more inclined to act politically and do stuff, be far more strident in my approach than if I was less fearful of the consequences of that for my soul or my sense of self. If I realize that my sense of self might be more porous than what I'd imagined it to be, I may be less attached to defending it or what I deemed to be its interests. And that might lead to a different kind of politics, potentially. But Moore is not as persuaded by this, and I think Andrew is not either. Andrew doesn't think mindfulness changes anything. Why?
I mean, it's like, I don't know, I feel like everybody made like really good points, like you made some really good points earlier about like, you know, making connections and stuff like that. But I feel like the practice of, you know, mindfulness itself, it's kind of like, at some point there's still going to be some clash, because if these are like deeply held beliefs, like maybe your change of, like you said, your self is more porous or something. But at the same time, it's like just becoming more aware of, oh, your decisions in your past life made you a murderer, and these systems interact in such a way that you are a murderer. In a certain way, you still believe that person is a murderer. So at some point, when it comes to political decision making, like I feel like mindfulness doesn't actually change or have any real meaning in that process, I guess. And I could be wrong, you know. I don't know.
kind of agree with that.
So all this was fluff until now, Mara?
No, because there was a line just now that I read in the article that was all like, it makes you less self-righteous, less stressed, and less blah, blah. I'm like, okay, that just makes you rational. So you're just bringing more rationality into it. But that was talking about the Western mindfulness. I think you have to be Buddhist, in my opinion, to really understand this and practice it. Otherwise, the people who kind of westernized it, like Mr. John, just kind of.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say earlier, is I think, you know, you made a great point, Summer made a great point, is that we have like this orientalized view of mindfulness. Like, obviously Thich Nhat Hanh isn't the same type of thing as like Deepak Chopra, but a lot of his books are basically just on mindfulness. Be aware of the sun. Hey, you're having a nice day. Be present of it. Like that in a political context, it's obviously not that extreme, but our view of like Buddhism is just crystals, self-help, and stuff like that. It's not, exactly, yeah. It's like you're not taking it to its logical conclusions as a religious and political tradition.
So you get the last word. We're out of time. Last word.
I think what ultimately this lecture really makes me question is how